It's an honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Nilia Viscardi Etchart, who will present the bureaucracy of school punishment insight from research in Uruguay. Professor Nilia Viscardi Etchart is sociologist and research from Uruguay, currently serving as director of the Human Rights Directorate of the National Public Education Administration, and director of Frank Uruguayan Center for Advancement at the Faculty of Social Science and the Faculty of Human and Educational Science in University of La República. She has led and participated in numerous national and international research projects related to young violence, democracy participation, educational institution, and security policy. Among her many publications, we highlight the recent book, The Bureaucracy of Punishment, Conflict and Responses in Secondary Education in Uruguay, which directly inform today's presentation and offer a critical analysis of institutional responses to conflict and punishment in secondary education.
Buenos días. Muchas gracias por su presentación.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for your presentation, Professor Moro. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you all today. And especially I would like to greet Veronica and Florencia and all the colleagues that have welcomed us so warmly in Chile recently, and it is a pleasure for me to continue this dialogue and this reflection that I assume will have critical emphasis in order to think about education, but I think that our potential and our richness from research and academia is to be able to move in a theoretical, freedom of space where critical, it's not intended to disrupt the work or the policies or practices or institutions, but criticism is also done in a space that's understood as a space for dialogue, for a space for interaction, for a space of co-production of knowledge together with teachers, and that many times in education they are also researchers. So this is many times not possible to generate this sort of discussion. So many years ago, Foucault acknowledge that getting to know something is to distance yourself. So every time that we are researching some exclusion, conflict in secondary education, we establish a framework that gets some distance from very difficult topics such as everyday practices of institutions, treatment of convivencia, conflicts. So it is a very difficult discourse to be sustained, but we hold to it with the will of continue to work for the transformation of our schools. So I'm going to center around the contributions of this book that systematizes research of many years carried out with Leonel Rivero and Veronica Miaga. The elements of the research of the book that what centralizes what Veronica Leiva has pointed out as a central concept has to do with punitive discipline. There are, the traditional studies, that were marking this distance that took place regarding the meritocracy in schools. So what happened in school depends on student ability and intelligence in order to reach goals that the schools would propose. So if they learned or did not learn, if they attended or they did not attend, if they ended a cycle, completed a cycle, for much of the 20th century was seen as an expression of their individual abilities. So as all of you may know, this had a shift in the 70s as a result of many different theoretical, convergence and contributions of Foucault's sociology and transformed these two institutions and these two lines of thought skyrocket. The first one shows that the results of the educational system, learning, continuity, are related to inequalities, social inequalities, and structural inequalities, however it's conceived, class or different layers or stratas, has different theoretical, perspectives. But what makes us think that low vulnerable areas are less capable and higher levels are more intelligent. And some of the studies talk about the distance between the school culture and the home culture that explains the possibilities for success of students. And that shows that this great political capital that it is to generate an educational system that allows us to, have access to the job world and equal opportunities is questionable. So everything that structural sociology contributes to education in the 70s. And all the Foucault perspective in which these institutions that are continue to be key to access rights, housing, schools, health system, to defend life, police forces, military forces, all these institutions are crossed about discipline studies. So school, in particular, it starts to be, like a disciplinary artifact. So the school, resisted the two critical lines, and that has been able to dialogue with this contribution and look at itself. So nowadays, the idea is to continue to take education, the mandate of education, to everyone, the most vulnerable. There's more access to education. The primary learning cycle, it's fulfilled at a universal level. Secondary education is, increasing its coverage to more populations. But we know that although they achieve or they cover or they reach certain populations, they're still deficient in some aspects. But we do have this capacity of the educational system to fight against social inequality and the reproductive mechanisms that replication mechanisms that they have. So those of us that work in convivencia and school violence is based on absorbing criticism as a disciplinary device. It supposes that many of us, we do not think that the idea is to annul or void the school as a space for defense of knowledge and promotion of knowledge and creating knowledge, but to point to dynamics. And you can see that the dilemma of modern societies as the best devices to make knowledge arrive to different classes are bureaucratic mechanisms that so we're always living with this paradox. So to devise something that will allow everyone to have access to this right might produce sometimes this think that it hasn't to do with, doesn't make much sense. So we might do this in schools, but then the routine, control, and many other tasks sometimes will become obstacles for, good and real learning. So we have classes, we have the schedule, we have discipline, and we don't learn anything. So how does this happen? So this happens to the school, not because the school is bad, not because the school also has the ability to interpret this criticism, but it cancels this dynamics. So what we try to do in this bureaucracy of punishment is to think from these places the persistence of institutional practices that are very specific, that they don't have to do with time regulation, control of the body, or administration of movement. Those are the timbers, bell ring, roll call, or uniform or no uniform. So the difficult transition from production of obedience, it is a delicate topic in school, a difficult topic. At what moment are we doing a production of obedience? That it is necessary to a certain point to coexist together in an institution where we have, 300 people, and where routines and everyday, actions makes it necessary. It's not. We cannot have 300, 400, or 1,000 people coexisting in a building if we don't have rules. But from when did we go from, the production of routines to violent psychologies, where violence on the subject is the problem? So in this dialectic, it's where we move in this research of punishment bureaucracy. So it's legitimate to talk about circulation, rules, hygiene, but punitive discipline, it's another approach, and supposes to attend to other types of problems. So therefore the modern school has to be thought in this tensions between more general topics, the relationship with knowledge, learnings that are not those that are strictly addressing right now. Although to think about these problems of discipline, normalization, having social control, they also supposed to understand the basis on which knowledge and learning takes place. We're not discussing how to teach, what type of learnings, but there is a indisputable relationship. So how do we go from this to the idea of a school climate? First, because we are, we're having discussions, and the punishment bureaucracy or bureaucracy of punishment, we are separated some of the discussions, mainly that one that wanted to reduce school violence to vulnerable just young people that were vulnerable, and they were we know that they are usually lured by more violent markets, and they're going to have an effect in school. So on balance in neighborhood, and if they are suffering violence, sexual violence, if there are problems in the roads to get to school, they don't have electricity, it's a dangerous road. There's so many other circumstances that might affect violence, and they're going to go in the school. But for a long time, they wanted to explain, youth violence and relate it to school violence, and that's very far away from the truth. So what we point to is the encounter between school culture and disciplines or dynamics, organizational dynamics that intervene in the generation of inequalities and institutional cultures and tensions between regulation and order, but then a culture of obedience and punishment, and the difficulty of take the faculty teams out of this punishment dynamics that were historically, permanent in education. We have it in Uruguay. We have a pedagogical museum in Uruguay and in many other countries where you could, see old practices. Teachers would put like donkey ears on their students, or will make them walk on, corn seeds. And so physical punishment was present as a way of reforming behavior. And now we're looking at an institution that has more than 100 years of work, and it was forged on the basis of physical punishment as a way of maintaining control. And if you see, we see school as so, in addition to these problems, we had to look at all the pedagogies to install the idea of the student as a subject of rights. So part of this school discipline concept was oriented to the tutelage perspective of a kid that does not know what happens, an adult that regulates through obedience. So how do we go from punishment as a way of setting limits or boundaries to social educational measures? This goes through youth penality aspect and school, because school is a place of social justice and resolution of social conflicts and human conflict. This is why we have this search of identifying the punishment culture that is pointing to those small fields and transforming them into research fields or research areas. We would analyze something that we call, the behavioral notebooks. Those are books. There are books where the reasons for assigning some sort of a disciplinary sanction are written there as a record. They are a reproduction of what you would do at a police station when you want to denounce some crime or something. So this would cause an intervention process. So they are talking about, denouncing or claiming, and also sanction as dynamics for the school. So when we think about, of course, we start with on the basis of a school environment. There's lots of conflict. There's going to be some conflict. It's very difficult. I was talking to some students and working with them how difficult it is to explain that a researcher is asking, to explain that, a symbolic violence is actually exerted in a school. It makes no sense. So all the selection of knowledges is arbitrary. So this mathematics counts and this other math doesn't count, or this Spanish language counts and this other Spanish language doesn't count. So we defend it for a number of political principles, but we know that education, as Tukel was saying, has function with magic thought and religious traditions, and has fulfilled or become many different things to many different people. And then I can defend in definitive, it's still an imposition of a group of ideas that we can defend as the best ones. But the educational system works when those who have the job to teach transmit ideas that are accepted by the students, ideas that go from curricular components to routine, organization, etc. So the way of regulating conflict that we are, addressing, and that which is what Veronica works, the punitive way of conflict regulation, and we are able to, observe scientifically that there is an objective problem when institutions are not able to process convivencia problems, learning problems, and dialogic mechanisms, and they still use reinforcing these practices that are, pertaining to the former model. And this criticism is established knowing that it's very difficult for an institution that has so many years to change these practices. So this disciplinary, rosters, suspensions, expulsions, these are micro practices that are continue to create this dynamics of punitive discipline that we describe and in detail in the book. We also describe practices that promote participation. So we're not saying this is the only thing that schools are doing. And the book also wants to identify dynamics of chess playing, theater, and teachers that work from other perspective, the relationship. We're not saying that they don't exist, but here we are describing the conflicting aspect, and that tends to take place and express within these punitive mechanisms that are associated in general with the prevalence of sanctions, few or little student participation, vertical communication, the idea that there are implicit rules that have high consequences, and the consequences of pedagogy that is based on punishment rather than dialogue. I don't know how I'm doing on time.
Pero para, digamos, avanzar, ¿no?
Aproximadamente 5 minutos por si acaso.
Perfecto.
Okay, so I have 5 more minutes, but in order to move forward, what we have here is a need of changing the concept of authority that was historically a dynamic of, hierarchy dynamic, and so whoever has the role has the knowledge. So whoever is the teacher controls the whole the knowledge, and whatever they say defines and imposes their thought because of their hierarchy. So this, of course, collides with current conditions because the access to the roles continues to be regulated by knowledge logics. But we also know that without acknowledgement or recognition of the other, the students are not interested in what the teacher is saying. The students are not being recognized or acknowledged by the teachers. As it happens in the media, someone intends to centralize all knowledge in the area of communication. It's deemed to fail. When I was a student 30, 40 years ago, culture was still marked by the position of by having the book. Whoever had the book had the knowledge, and those who did not share the book could appear as the only one that knew. The photocopies started to, confront this, but the access to the book would determine the access to knowledge, and the professor, just as in feudalism, those who were in the abbey and the clergy, they had the knowledge. Today, with the existence of the information society, where every material is available online, it becomes evident that this place, it's unreal and impossible. Access to information does not go through, censorship or cutting. It is, to manage a group of knowledge and having the ability to activate some knowledge that it's not a unique position of that teacher, and that changes, completely changes the authority keys, and the concept of caring. It's a revolutionary concept, because we talk about the importance of care by teachers. So there are many different aspects that transform the pedagogical practice. Other processes that the book points to, it's based on, in the case of one student, that it's useful for us to make a last, insight. We cannot think about violence or discipline or punitive discipline as a eventual or isolated fact that happens. We understand these processes and these dynamics as processes in which a series of facts accumulate throughout the school year, and they mark, a trend, or and they allow the conditions so some events happen. So when they happen, these exclusion mechanisms, educational, because of conflict problems or coexistence problems between students and teachers, we find a process. We see disruptive behaviors, teaching pressures, and the scaling up of the conflict at an institutional level, and in the end, the judicial aspects. And this doesn't happen, abruptly, but it is a process. So the importance of thinking devices and mechanisms, punitive devices and mechanisms, as devices and educational processes of long term, which are hardly going to be, understood from the perspective of just one actor, parents, students, faculty, principal, but its result has to accumulate from an objective and analysis point of view. A series of rights thought from research and school management as results that go beyond the single perspective of an actor, because the research shows clearly that many teachers have the will that disruptive students or teachers that are troubled behaviors find a space to resolve the conflict with dialogue. But however, although many teachers have this will, this hardly takes place. And that's when the mechanisms of the social sciences, uncover, and general studies show, allow us to point to social processes that cannot be reduced to what one individual researcher one researcher can catch through just one individual perspective. We have to take into account, bureaucratic dynamics, regulations, statutes, school climate, concrete actions, influence of the social reality, and they're gonna converge and construct a school dynamic that is very difficult to describe, and they're very challenging to transform. Uruguay continues to exclude young people and teenagers from their educational system. We know It is an institutional challenge, but until today, it's still difficult to think how to work with the relationship, how to work with the convivencia, and so the bearable or unbearable, aspect of the human relationship that continues to be intervened by excluding answers, low motivation, and they make this problem, this, ledger, behavioral ledger, or this sanction, a bigger, policy, educational policy problem. So I think until now, this is what I wanted to share with you today.
Perfecto. Muchísimas gracias, profesor.
Thank you so much, Professor Nilia. I thank you tremendously, and I thank everyone for their participation here today. And we will see each other next month in June for our next webinar. Thank you very much, and we hope that everyone has a great day. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.